He makes life hard for himself so that he can be free. The European makes himself a slave so that his life can be easy. It was not supposed to be like this urban confine. It was supposed to be deliberate in the woods. Accident is rather the opposite of deliberate. But perhaps there is some poetic justice to this, because it is easier to talk about Thoreau in the woods, but more in keeping with Thoreau's purpose to talk about Thoreau here with this accidental urbanism, because the idea of Thoreau is not to be in the woods, but to deal with the accidental and to push forward with the deliberate, you see. So the idea here was to juxtapose Thoreau as the American man, symbolically speaking, of course, with, well, and here the problem begins, with who as the European man. It is not for a want of great writers and poets. It is not for a want of rich literary heritage, but rather for a want of anything remotely approaching some sensible definition of a European. And we will get into this in a moment. But let us try to make the comparison, the symbolic comparison, by way of great writers, a great writer in the form of Thoreau, and a great question mark. We'll come to that for the European man as represented by a great question mark, I suppose. Well, why Thoreau? Well, let us start from this very simple notion that the American man is just that. Literally, it begins with the man, the person, the individual. And there is a very clear logic to this, you see, because the founding idea of America is that all men are created equal. What follows from this, as Jefferson's analogy elucidates, is that no one is born a horse to be ridden upon by others, and no one is born a rider or a master who can treat others as if they were horses. And precisely because no person or group of people have any divine right, any right whatsoever to govern others without their consent, so the only type of government that is left in this situation is the rule of the people. And the fundamental unit that composes the people is the individual. And so if the people are to rule themselves, it is only logical that the fundamental unit of the people should be capable of self-government. And of course, sometimes there is a tendency that's quite popular, has been for a long time, to associate America with material wealth, consumption. This is quite true, but it is a byproduct. It is a secondary aspect of the primary principle, fundamental characteristic of the symbolic American man, which is the wealth of being independent, the internal wealth of the independent soul, who, like Thoreau, has a project for a deliberate life. Now, Tocqueville, of course, made much of the pitfalls of this individualism, which severed the bonds of duty between members of a society. Bonds which, on the one hand, yes, were hierarchical, placing some above and some below, putting each man and woman and child into some station from which there was no recourse. But liberation from this station, from this hierarchy, from this chain of right and duty, in Tocqueville's mind, was synonymous with fending for oneself, which was basically akin to facing all of the dangers of life alone. And there is some truth to that, particularly since individualism risks that the individual collapses into himself. Thoreau had a very grounded project. He was very aware of what he wanted to accomplish. Very disciplined. Discipline is essential to self-government. If you are just carried by the wind, you probably will end up being carried by the crowd, the silly stereotype of the individual who rebels because that's what everybody's doing. That was not Thoreau, I think, and that is not the type of individualism that Thoreau represents. However, it is also necessary to point out that even if the vast majority of cases of individualism are cases of individuals collapsing into themselves, embroiling themselves in some form of decline, freedom as a decline, freedom as license, as loneliness, even depression, alienation, hedonism. Well, the prodigal son is a very important, essential component to American culture. We often say that American culture is rooted in a broader Western heritage, which, in my view, is mistakenly conflated with the idea that American culture is somehow rooted in Europe, because the heritage that American culture partakes of is closer to nature than to any convention. But the prodigal son is an example of how even that individualism of which Tocqueville warns and which Tocqueville laments and which many well-meaning and thoughtful Americans following Tocqueville believe afflicts America, speak of, and the result is not a bad one. You have to fall down to be able to get back up. And the point here is that even in the most egregious forms of radical or extreme individualism, there is the possibility of the prodigal son, the accidental self-governing man who takes his kicks, gets knocked about, and is molded by adversity into the type of citizen that a self-governing society requires. So all of that, on the one hand, is the American man. What about the European man? Who is he symbolically? Well, the European man is a negation of real Europeans. See, real Europeans are all wound up and bound up in language, history, culture, very particular organic cultures. So if there is to be a European, it must be someone who is invisible, has no face, like their money. You will notice that there is architecture, but there are no faces. Now, you may say that there are people behind the architecture and ideas and historical eras and interconnection, but there are no faces there. There are no people. There are no individuals. There cannot be any individuals, because all great individuals in Europe are always bound up in their language, culture, convention. That is where they are. And now you may say that this is a generalization, and I invite you to offer examples of great Europeans who should represent the symbolic European man. But whenever I try in my mind to bring forth a name, a tidal wave of doubt appears, argument after argument after argument for why this or that particular individual clearly cannot be representative of Europe or Europeans, because there is a sense in which the more European an individual is, the more that individual is a negation of any real Europeans, which is probably why very few people in Europe speak of themselves as such, unless, of course, they too wish to negate. Does this mean that the European is a convention? Is the European invisible because he is bound in the social hierarchies of right and duty of which Tocqueville spoke? This may also explain why there is a sense in which the European individualist is by necessity a nihilist. If we look at all great individualist writers of the continent, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, they are nihilists of one sort or another. And I don't use this term pejoratively, to simply make an observation. There is a great yearning in Nietzsche to be free of what is tiresome, what is tiring in Europe. Kierkegaard does not want the worldly. He turns towards the divine. As soon as we begin to speak more concretely of particular European states, cultures, systems, languages, what do we really find there that is common to them? Some form of the worship of the stamp, a recurring clerk, administrator, officer, the official, let us say, the official. And this official is without any of the humorous ironies and pathetic pettiness of the Russian stamp master. No, this one takes themselves very seriously. Perhaps Pontius Pilate is a European. Well, that's a very harsh assessment, I suppose. And one can say that it is an assessment that suggests that the man of ideas has more to say in America than in Europe, which on the face of it seems absurd, because America is governed by practical men And Americans themselves are very practical people. But Thoreau was a practical person. His undertaking was supremely practical. His quest for living deliberately, for truly living life, was a practical quest. He counts and economizes. He recounts simple labors of survival. And the poetic beauty that we find in them is caused not so much by some flowery speeches of his, but by the fact that they are a record of his attempt at independence, you see. He makes life hard for himself so that he can be free. The European makes himself a slave so that his life can be easy. And this is the key difference between the jovial, joy of life European, who on the face of it seems to be living life to the fullest, as opposed to the American, who is busy thinking about the bills and work, practical things. But the one who is working and thinking about practical things is thereby being molded into an independent individual, a free, independent individual. While the other, well, perhaps they are just a slave to their passions. And this joy of life that they evoke is just a mask. It is why, if you look back at 19th century America, as the United States expanded, it expanded in the place of European modes and orders. Many see America as an extension of European modes and orders, as inspired by European modes and orders. But is it really the case? Certainly there are thinkers from Europe who have inspired American ideals and American culture. But were these thinkers European? Were they the products of their conventions, the slaves of their conventions, or were they philosophers and poets and writers who looked more to nature than to convention? Well, as with the previous episode, this episode will be inconclusive. And perhaps that is the conclusion.